She has a doctorate in literature, and it was a really wonderful opportunity to get to learn or think about poetry in a reflective way, and she's going to tell us what she's going to teach us. But Dr. Stokes, we are really happy that you agreed to offer this class, and I hope that these classes are the beginning of new ways that we experience Yom Kippur. Even if, God willing, we are all back in the building next year, we can still keep studying. So take it away.
Very good. Thank you so much, Rabbi Nathan, for inviting me to speak to you all. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Shana Tova. I hope you are all having a meaningful holiday. I will say on a side note that I'm impressed that you're all awake. This for me is usually like the nap portion of the holiday. So thank you for being here. And again, I'm impressed that you're awake and are upright. As Rabbi Nathan mentioned, I'm a longtime Temple member, and I am also a professor of English at Trinity University, which is right down the street from Temple Beth-El. As Rabbi Nathan said, as part of Yom Kippur programming, we're going to have a more casual conversation for a little while this afternoon about a few poems. I'm going to give like a little introductory spiel, but this is not a lecture course. I could, if you were interested, give you a lecture on, 19th century American prosody. I'm guessing that this would, Terry seems interested, but I'm guessing that the numbers would shrink. So I'm going to give a kind of introductory spiel, but I would like for us to talk together a little bit. In time of COVID, it's hard for us to have some community interaction. So I'm hoping that together we'll be able to read some poetry and talk about some poems that don't really have Jewish content or a direct connection to the holiday, but they're two poems I've selected because they engage in some of the reflections that I think are so central to our work on this holiday. I again, those of you who are live streaming, I invite you to enter the Zoom room if you would like to participate in the conversation. But again, it's late in the holiday, and I will just leave you to do whatever works best for you. But first, I would like to, in the chat, I would just like to put in the chat the link for you to access the poems. I will share the poems with you on my screen. But if you would like to, I encourage you to, if you'd like to click on the link, it should take you to the two poems on the Temple Beth-El website so that you can have access to them more directly. But I want to first share my screen with you. Can you see this? Okay, so just to talk, I want to talk a little bit, do a little kind of introductory spiel, just to talk a little bit about the role of poetry in kind of religious reflection and religious worship and religious engagement. So I'm going to talk a little bit and then we'll read some poems together, but I really encourage you to, participate however as much or as little as you would like. So once we read the poems, Jerry is going to be moderating for us. I thank you, Jerry. So what I encourage you to do, if you'd like to speak or like to contribute, and I encourage you to do so, be sure you raise your hand on the Zoom links below. So I think the way you do that is you click on participants, and then at the very bottom there should be a link that says raise hand. And so I warmly encourage you to do so, and Jerry will unmute you, and she'll be our moderator. So thank you again, Jerry. So again, here is the link. But I want to just begin a little bit by mentioning that poetry is. Today, we think of poetry as a really elite form. It's a literary form that for most, there are some people who read poetry, who love poetry, but they tend to be a very, very small minority of people who are active readers in the United States. That was not always the case, but I will say that poetry has really, from the very beginning of Western history, poetry has really always been a medium that has lent itself really wonderfully well to religious reflection and religious engagement. There's lots of reasons why this might be, but I think the one way of thinking about this is that poetry is not the language of the everyday. The poetry for us is, and I will mention that, how do we define poetry? Poetry is different in every culture. It's different. The conventions of poetry are different in every culture. They're different across time periods. What we might think of as poetry is very different from, what, an early modern Persian poet would have written. So the conventions of poetry are very different across time and space. But the bottom line of poetry is that it is language that is set apart. It is language that is set apart from everyday communication, from everyday speech. It's often highly formal. It has many conventions that the poet is expected to adhere to. So it is not the language of the everyday. It is set apart from and is separate from everyday communications. And it's useful for us to remember that that is also the definition of that which is holy, right? If we were to define what is holy, what is sacred, strictly speaking, those things are defined by that which is set apart, that which is sort of apart from us. And really in that way, poetry kind of lends itself really naturally. Well, nothing is natural, but really lends itself quite well to engagement in or reflection on the special topics that are not of the everyday, that have their own kind of limited, kind of restricted, special formal language. So I'll just simply point out here that from the very beginning of the Western literary tradition, poetry in the West has from the very beginning really been used specifically for communication with the divine, right? From the very beginning. So I have just one example here on the left, the opening lines of Homer's Iliad, right? One of the first remembered works of literature in the West. The very opening lines of the Iliad call on the deity, right? Directly engage, right? Sing, goddess, sing of the rage of Achilles, Peleus, the son of Peleus. And if we had time, we might go through this, but from the very beginning, the poem communicates with the divine and it asks for kind of intimate communion with the divine. And it describes, right, the poet here seeks intimacy with the divine. So at the very beginning, poetry is the language of religious communication. For us as Jews, it's easy to forget that much of the Hebrew Bible includes poetry. We don't always remember this. And in fact, I don't know enough about ancient Hebrew to be able to comment on the specific conventions of ancient Hebrew poetry. Perhaps Rabbi Nathan or Rabbi Stahl would be willing to tell us a little bit about this. But there's a lot of poetry in the Hebrew Bible. It's very easy to overlook. When you're looking at the Bible, usually the way that verse is communicated is that the lines are indented usually, and the lines that are poetry, they don't kind of move from like line to line organically. Instead, there are very clear line breaks that communicate that these lines are in verse. So here's just a random example I plucked from Genesis 8:22, and again, just out of nowhere, in the middle of this narration, the Genesis kind of moves into the language of poetry. And here, just as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and the something, I can't even see what that says under my screen, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So again, just like it breaks into the language of poetry. Again, just more examples of poetry in the Hebrew Bible. I know Rabbi Stahl just gave a talk on the book of Job, but it's easy to forget that so much of the book of Job is in poetry. The first two books of the book of Job, where we get the kind of narrative prehistory, we get sort of explanations of God's debate, with the adversary, with his debating partner, and they make this bet, and God does all of these terrible things to Job. All of those books, I think, are in prose. But then when Job starts to deliberate about these events with his friends, it moves into the world of verse, right, into poetry. And then I think when God speaks out of the whirlwind to Job and offers a sort of explanation for his sufferings, those lines are also in poetry. Again, as a way of communicating, right, that poetry is a kind of language that is set apart, right, that God in the book of Job speaks in verse. And again, just one more example here is the Psalms, right? We have an entire book of the Bible and the Proverbs as well, composed entirely in verse. And here there is like the sense in the book of Psalms that poetry is a special language earmarked for reflection on the divine, communion with the divine, and the language of praise for the deity. So less fun, well, for you maybe, but not for me. I will say that, and I can't help myself, Anne Bradstreet was not Jewish, as you may have gathered. So just to give you a little bit of context about the workings of poetry in religious life in the United States, or really in the transatlantic Anglo-American world, we think of the Puritans, some of the early colonial settlers of North America in the 17th century. We think of them as a really harsh, forbidding people, which is certainly true, but poetry figured centrally in Puritan religious observance. Common people among the Puritans wrote poetry as part of their everyday lives, as part of their own kind of daily religious reflections and religious worship. And so this is a very famous example. This is Anne Bradstreet, who is, I think, the first woman in North America to publish. She was a mother of 8. She was a very busy woman who wrote poetry in her spare time. And her brother-in-law collected her poems and had them published without her consent, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that for the Puritans, and here's another example of Edward Taylor, for the Puritans, poetry was the language of religious reflection. And Edward Taylor was a Puritan minister who would write poems in preparation for writing his sermons, that he would write poetry as a way of getting warmed up, as a way of organizing his thoughts, and as a kind of preparation for his sermons. And I'm not going to suggest that Rabbi Nathan or Rabbi Stahl try this, but there is a kind of Puritan tradition of religious people writing poetry, not meant for publication. This was designed really, it was like writing in a journal, just for their own kind of private thoughts. And so again, poetry writing today is not something that Americans undertake in great numbers, but really, I just want to point out that really until the American Civil War, everybody in the United States read poetry and everybody wrote poetry. Poetry writing was something that really, like, everybody did. It was part of just kind of self-reflection. And it was part of everyday reading. I'll remind you that the novel was generally regarded as trashy and sinful. It was generally believed that reading novels could cause all girls to become unmarriageable. So watch it, but really everybody read poetry and everybody wrote poetry. It was widely accessible. Newspapers printed poetry. There were like salespeople on the street who would just sell poems, like single sheets of poetry. It was really all over the place. But it was also one of the very few means by which women in the United States could gain any kind of access to religious worship. So here's just an example of 2 poems written by one of the most famous American writers of the 19th century, Harriet Beecher Stowe. These are 2 poems that she wrote. And they were printed in periodicals, but they were both set to music and they were included in hymnals and then sung in congregational worship. So all of this is to say that private poetry writing really could circulate in kind of widely in the United States. Okay, so again, this is just another image so you can see how poetry reading was a widely undertaken activity. It was not something that was restricted to the classroom. It was something that people did pretty much every day. So I would like to I selected 2 poems for us to read together. The first is by Alice Carey, and I'll bring it up in just a second. I want to give you a little bit of background about her. So the first poem is by Alice Carey. She was a quite I'm guessing you have not heard of her. She was a well-known and well-respected poet in the United States in the 19th century. She was from rural Ohio. Around 1850, she and her sister Phoebe moved to New York, and very quickly she and her sister Phoebe, also a writer, became really prominent figures in the antebellum New York literary scene. So what I would like to do now, I would like for us to read this poem together. So this poem is called How and Where. And it's a poem that I think we'll see really does a lot of the self-reflection and self-examination that we are in a way charged to do on Yom Kippur. So the poem has, I think, 4 stanzas. Could I have 4 volunteers each to read a stanza? You could raise your hand. It's like PE class. Any volunteers? Jerry, do you see any volunteers?
Sometimes you have to volunteer people. I think
Okay.
if their
They're voluntold.
video is on, that means they're game to read. So that's
Okay.
how we usually go by.
All right. Anybody game to read?
Oh,
Judy.
Amy Strickland raised her hand.
Amy Strickland, thank you so much. So Amy, you're going to read stanza number 1. Terry, do you feel comfortable reading stanza number 2? All right, very good. Judy Lackritz, do you feel comfortable reading stanza number 3? Okay, very good. Marcia, would you read stanza number 4? All right, awesome. Okay, so Amy, you ready to go?
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. How are we living like herbs in a garden that stand in a row and have nothing to do but to stand there and grow? Our powers are perceiving so dull and so dead, they simply extend to the objects above us. The moth having all his dark pleasure without us, the worm in his bed.
Can you guys see my screen, by the way? No. Okay, so I think my screen sharing has stopped. So let me reshare.
You're back.
Okay, can you see that? Yes, okay, thank you. All right, very good. So Terry, your stanza number 2.
All right. And thus we are living and fading and falling and rotting, alas, like the grass or the flowers that grow in the grass. Is life worth our having? The insect humming, the wild bird is better that sings as it flies, the ox that turns up its great face to the skies when the thunder is coming.
Judy?
Where are we living? In passion and pain and remorse do we dwell, creating yet terribly hating our hell? No triumph achieving, no grossness refining. The wild tree does more, for his coat of rough barks he trims with green mosses and checks with the marks of a long summer shining.
We're dying, not living. Our senses shut up and our hearts faint and cold, upholding old things just because they're old. Our good spirits grieving, we suffer our springs of promise to pass without sowing the land, and hungry and sad in the harvest time stand, expecting good things.
Okay, thank you. So again, I mean, I'm not going to lecture at you about this poem. There's I see Bonnie Lyons is here, so I'm hoping that we can dragoon Bonnie, and a poet and an English professor into engaging conversation with us. But any comments or anything strike you about this poem? Anything seem noteworthy? Just either wave like this or raise your hand, and Jerry can unmute you. Go ahead, Bonnie. Jerry, can you unmute Bonnie?
Well, I think they're talking about death, life and death of the soul, or the living death versus how to be truly alive. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's much concerned with actual biological death. It's how to live most deeply while you're alive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That the poem is asking about right. It begins by saying, how are we living? Right? How are we moving through the world? How are we going about our lives? And it offers some suggestions about it offers some, I think, interestingly, one thing that I think is maybe a little bit different from Judaism here. So I will say that the opening line of the poem, how are we living? Really kind of accesses one of the tasks of Yom Kippur for us, which is to engage in self-reflection, to kind of consider, how are we living? What are we doing? What could we do better? What do we need to atone for? What do we need to resolve? So the poem asks this opening prompt. And then interestingly, I'll just point out that the poem, well, okay, I don't need to get bogged down, but the poem at the end of every stanza talks about events in the natural world. And suggests, which is interesting to me, suggests again and again that it describes things that happen in the natural world. Like I love the ox that turns up to his great face to the skies. And I love the wild tree does more. This is in the third stanza. For his coat of rough barks, he trims with green mosses and checks with the marks of the long summer shining. One thing that's noteworthy here is that she thinks of nature as something that we should emulate, maybe something that we should copy, something that we should take inspiration from. And I'm just struck a little bit by how infrequently we see something like that, in kind of Judaism, that nature doesn't really figure. I mean, I invite the rabbis to weigh in, but nature doesn't really figure all that prominently in kind of Jewish as a model of a kind of Jewish ethics here. But
Claudia,
in a way,
can I ask a question? I'm noting that some of the nature that is talked about is very passive and some of it is more active. So I thought that's interesting. So, it's like all out there for us to choose. We can be passive and let it all just happen to us, or we can be more active in our engagement.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it is interesting. She suggests here that there's something about the tree that just sort of growing moss seems to be a kind of model for us to follow. But let's sort of take a look at this poem. Are there lessons in this poem that we think we can glean in the context of Yom Kippur? Are there things that she says here that we prompts for self-reflection or advice that are worth addressing or engaging or taking to heart?
In the third stanza, for instance, where she asks, no triumph achieving, I guess in a way it's asking, what are you doing? What is your life about? What is the meaning of your life?
That's right.
No grossness refining speaks to me of the Jewish call to correct the wrongness in the world.
That's right. Right. Tikkun olam, to kind of, there's a sense here that a meaningful life. I mean, the passivity that Rabbi Nathan mentioned, I think, is noteworthy because the poem begins by saying, how are we living? Like herbs in a garden that stand in a row and have nothing to do but to stand there and grow. She says here that, for her, or that it's not enough just to kind of get by. That's not enough. That's not living. That's not living mindfully. That's not living in a meaningful way. But interestingly, she suggests that for an herb to stand and grow is not ideal, but it's okay for trees to grow moss. I mean, I take your point that in a way, she has any number of different opinions about nature, but she says here that it's just, and then she says, our powers of perceiving so dull and so dead, that for Alice Carey, part of living a meaningful life means sharpening your modes of perception, right? Moving through the world in a mindful way, being, like allowing yourself to see and to perceive in all of your different senses, rather than just, and this is something to take seriously, which is that, many of us just kind of move through our lives, not really paying attention to what we see around us, really focused on the next task at hand. And many of us are, ensconced at home. We might imagine that there's not a whole lot to see, but for Alice Carey, she says that mindful living entails kind of active perception here. Like, so for maybe this is something for us to think about in the context of Yom Kippur, right? Which is like cultivating a kind of mindfulness or attentiveness to the world around us, which for her also includes the natural world. I mean, one other thing, so to that point about no triumph achieving, no grossness refining, there is a sense here in her poem that that life, a meaningful life for her entails right, setting goals and working toward those goals, right? You don't necessarily have to achieve them, but you should like try to move yourself, kind of advance and pursue those goals in an active way. Anything?
We have two comments, one from Mark Hendel and then from Deborah Morrow.
Okay, very good. Come on in.
So one line that reminds me of what we read recently, where God placed before us, life and death, choose life. In the second stanza here, it says, is life worth our having? Is the insect a humming? The wild bird is better that sings as it flies. That kind of reminded me of the Yom Kippur mandate to, choose life and live in a certain way.
That's right. I think that's very helpful. And I think that helps us to see that for Alice Carey, like just being alive doesn't mean living. Just being alive doesn't mean choosing life, but living in a more mindful, attentive way, that for her is living. But she also kind of really emphasizes here, I think there is some sense of like work occupies an important role here. She says at the very last stanza, we promise our springs of promise to pass without sowing the land, and hungry and sad in the harvest time stand, expecting good things. So she suggests here that living doesn't mean just sort of waiting for things to happen. For her, it means that, if there are things in your life that you want, it's up to us to plant those seeds. It's to us to do the work and to set ourselves up for the things that we want. So to your point, I mean, living doesn't just mean being alive. It also means really taking some actions to perceive the world, to try to heal the world, and also to work. So in a way, we have we don't have Torah in here, but we have work and good deeds as things that contribute to life. Deborah, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, a line that really jumped out at me was creating yet terribly hating our hell. And so it seems like it's very relevant to current times. And yes, we have to take action, but perhaps also look at the ways that we damage ourselves. Ways we sabotage ourselves. So I thought that was interesting.
Absolutely. And it's, she suggests here that, the hell is not this thing that happens in the afterlife. It's something that is, in our daily lives. And it's something that in this case, she suggests, is sometimes of our own making. And she invites us, interestingly, in the 1850s to think about how we are so often the sources of our own suffering by the decisions that we make, the decision to not act, and so on. She suggests that we create and yet hate our hell. That in some ways, we create our own lives, or of our own making. I think Amy had her hand raised.
Also, then also Marcia Krasner had a comment.
Okay, all right, very good.
Okay, yeah, I was looking at the upholding old things just because they are old. And then she goes on to a promise to pass without sowing the land. It reminded me of Gloria Steinem when she said that nostalgia is a form of obstructionism because we just adhere to things. But if you think about it, nostalgia for things of the past, civil rights were not great in the past. Women didn't have rights in the past. We've got to plant our own seeds and harvest our own future. So
that's right. I think that's such an important point that you've just made, and you really beautifully allowed us to see some of the contemporary resonances of what she says here, which is that that convention and tradition are, we often yearn for the past, we often yearn for the old days, the good old days. But, I think your point allows us to see, like, for whom were those old days good, right? Not for people of color, not for women, often not for Jews, that this hearkening back to an imaginary nostalgic past allows us to preserve a status quo of inequality and inequity. So I think you've made an important point. Marcia?
The other I had read, and it was on many of us may have read the book, The Overstory, about 2 years ago. It was got all sorts of awards about trees and
oh, sorry, Marcia, I think you froze.
yeah, the wild tree does more.
I'm sorry, I've just missed all of that. Do you mind?
Barks, he trims with gray moss, or measure without us. I mean, almost like saying, look at the world, look around you, look at the beauty in the world, and try to not imitate it, but try to find your own pleasure, whatever.
Yeah. So sorry, you keep cutting in and out.
That your life will have meaning, so that you're living, not dying.
Okay.
And I love this poem. I think it's really beautiful.
I'm glad you like it. I think it's a beautiful poem too. One thing I just want to say that's unusual about this poem is, and then I want to move on to the next poem, which some of you may already know. But what's unusual about this poem is that when Alice Carey wrote this poem in the 1850s, sentimentalism it's called sentimentalism, was the dominant literary movement in the period, especially for women. And sentimental literature, some of you may be familiar with, was enormously popular, but these texts often depicted young women seeking self-betterment through self-examination. And so in that respect, it's really compatible with Yom Kippur. But what's unusual about this poem is we're not watching Alice Carey or our poem speaker engage in self-reflection. Instead, what she's doing is maybe lecturing at us a little bit more. She is offering religious instruction and religious advice. And well, maybe not religious, but life advice. And that, I have to say, is very unusual for women writers in this period in the 19th century. Okay, so unless there's an additional comment, I'd like to move on to the next poem, which I really love. This is how do I say? This is as old fart as you get. This is a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I'm guessing many of you have heard of Longfellow. Longfellow was in the United States in the 19th century the most popular poet. When Charles Dickens visited the United States, the one person he wanted to meet was Longfellow. I mean, he was like the Beyonce of poetry writing in the 19th century. And this poem, Psalm of Life, was his first big break. This was the poem that really put him on the international map. It was reprinted everywhere. American school children for generations were required to memorize and recite this poem. It was set to music and included in hymnals. One other thing about this poem is it is credited with coining and introducing a number of expressions into everyday English. So for instance, the expression footprints on the sands of time was coined and circulated in this poem. One other tidbit in this poem that has carried on a life of its own, which always makes me laugh, is you'll notice the fourth stanza. The first line is, "Art is long and time is fleeting." So those of you who remember the movie Rocky Horror Picture Show may remember the song "The Time Warp." Anyway, the Time Warp is quoting this poem by Longfellow. Neither here nor there, but this poem I think has, can you see the whole thing? Okay, so, right. I don't think you can see the whole thing here, can you?
Yes, we can.
You can, okay,
Yeah.
but I feel like actually sorry, hold on. I need to fuss a little bit because I don't think you can. You get to see my desktop. Isn't that nice? Okay, so I'll just scroll down because you can't see the whole thing. Could you? Because it's 9 stanzas.
No, we were able to.
You were, okay. Then let's go back to read mode. So it's 9 stanzas. So can I have 9 volunteers each to read a stanza? Again, I'll just sort of put it to you this way. This was a huge hit in the 19th century. Can I have 9 volunteers? Do I need to call on you?
You got Bonnie Lyons, Judy Lagras.
Okay, so Judy, you're stanza number 1. Fran Cohen, would you be stanza number 2? Bonnie, would you be stanza number 3? Let's see, Erica. Oh my goodness, Erica, would you be stanza number 4? Okay, very good. Let's see, Jonathan Gerwitz, stanza number 5. Jonathan, are you up for this?
I certainly am.
Okay, thank you. Marla Russell, would you be stanza number 6? Or maybe not. Josh, would you read?
Sure,
okay,
I will.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, who else? Any other volunteers? Rabbi Stahl, would you read stanza number 7?
I'll read one, Claudia.
Okay, I don't know who just said that, but you're hired. Stanza number 7?
7, okay.
Okay, very good. Let's see, Gail Alterman, would you read stanza number 8?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. And Temple President Amy Benedict, would you read the last stanza?
Sure, I'm on my phone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you
So
hear
you're
me? Sure. Okay, great. Yes, I'm the last one. Okay.
You're the last one. Okay, very good. And I have no idea who's number 1.
I am.
Jude? Okay, very good. You're up.
Tell me not, in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem.
Life is real, life is earnest,
and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest. Spoken of the soul.
Not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined end or way, but to act, that each tomorrow find us further than today.
Art is long and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave.
In the world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb, driven cattle, be a hero in the strife.
Trust no future, however pleasant, let the dead past bury its dead. Act in the living present, heart within and God overhead.
Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time.
Footprints that perhaps matter another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing shall take heart again.
Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learning to labor and to wait.
Okay, thank you. So one other thing about this poem that I just want to highlight for you is it's called a psalm, right? A psalm of life, that it presents itself in the vein of biblical religious poetry. And the poem has a subtitle, right? What the heart of the young man said to the psalmist. One thing I just, for the sake of time, I just want to mention that the poem begins in response. It begins in response to something we're not sure what. It doesn't identify what, but it begins in response by saying, don't tell me this, right? Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. That the poem begins by rebutting a kind of nihilistic notion that life doesn't matter. And the poem begins by saying, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. And then in the second stanza, Longfellow insists life is real, life is earnest, that he insists upon the kind of importance and the gravity of life. One other thing about this poem that I just want to clarify, and then I want to open things up, is this is the kind of poem that was really at the heart. So Longfellow, as I mentioned, was the most popular poet in the 19th century. But by the 20th century, his reputation really fell precipitously. Critics and scholars in the 20th century just thought that Longfellow was just sort of schmaltzy schlock. They did not take him seriously at all. That we see emerging in the 20th century this notion that literary greatness is characterized by difficulty. And Longfellow, at least in this poem, this is a really, I think, pretty clear poem. It's pretty intelligible. It doesn't innovate. It's not particularly experimental, and it's kind of moralistic. And so for all of those reasons, this poem and then Longfellow were really dismissed as kind of secondary figures of great unimportance. But I think this is actually a much more interesting poem than might immediately appear. One thing just for the sake of time, one thing I want to comment about this poem that I find particularly moving here is that what I sense partially is the kind of undertow of depression that underlies this poem, that the poem kind of recognizes the kind of willingness, the temptation, the urge to want to regard life as empty and meaningless, that nothing that we do matters. I will tell you that Longfellow suffered from depression all of his life. And this is a poem that, it's sort of like the original Keep Calm and Carry On poem, where he just sort of tells us that, like, it's hard. He says, this is the third stanza, not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined end or way. He says, we're not here to be happy. We're not here to be sad. Our emotions are not the thing that determine the measure of our lives, but to act, he says, act, that each tomorrow find us farther than today. And so this, in a way, is very similar to the Alice Carey poem, where she suggests, what is it like? No grossness refining, no triumph achieving. That action here is really, really important in the poem. I just sort of,
we have two people with their hands
please.
Raised.
Yeah, please.
Fran Cohen.
That Sorry, that was from before I was volunteering to read.
Oh, okay, thank you. Was there a second, Jerry?
Vito? No?
I was volunteering to read.
Okay, thank you. But one thing I want to point out here, just in the limits of time, is, this is a poem that really emphasizes action, and that is really in keeping with Judaism. Judaism really insists on the importance of righteous living today, that how you feel is your business, but what really matters is, that trying to live righteously and trying to make the right decisions and do the right thing in the moment. So there's a real emphasis here on action and doing the right thing. But there's another kind of aspect of the poem that I want to highlight that I find particularly moving here is, this is the second to last stanza, footprints. So this is the famous footprints on the sands of time, which, footprints that perhaps another sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing shall take heart again. This is a line or a stanza that tells us that our actions matter, not just because it's important for us to do the right thing, but he suggests here that other people are watching what we do. And if we do the right thing, if we're able to kind of, get out of bed and sort of soldier on in spite of how we feel, in spite of what we want to do, Longfellow suggests that other people might take notice of our behavior, and we might, just by virtue of moving through our lives, by doing the best that we can, we might provide a kind of inspiration to somebody else who is also suffering. So there's a recognition here in the poem that our action, this is not a kind of individualism here in promoting action. There's a recognition here that we're kind of in this together. And that we are kind of enmeshed in a kind of social web, and that our actions really matter, that we can help inspire people and motivate people and help them do their best by sheer virtue of moving through our lives and doing the best that we can. So in other words, you have more influence and impact than you probably think. And so do your best and know that that you might help other people make a similar decision. Anybody else want anything else about the poem that you'd like to add?
Josh Sutton made a point about rap or pop music being a modern form of popular poetry. I would say some of it. Some of it's really, really quite excellent and moving, and some of it is trash, as with poetry, I suppose.
That's right. But one thing I will say is that we should be, this is just my view sort of as an English professor, that, we should be wary of just discounting something just because it's popular. Discounting something because it's popular is something that was, not just done to Longfellow, but has been done to generations of women writers and writers of color as a way of just kind of discounting their work just by sheer virtue of its accessibility. So I would say, there are some really extraordinary rappers who belong in the Smithsonian.
Maybe not yet.
Anybody else? Anybody want to quote the time warp from Rocky Horror? I know you do. Okay, I think I'm out of time. Am I?
I think so, but Dr. Stokes, thank you. What an engaging and wonderful conversation, and to share a poem that maybe we didn't know, and then to expose us to a classic with renewed eyes was really a treat. And I, for one, really enjoyed the opportunity to study poetry, and reminded me how important it is. We've got more poetry to read in our Mishkan HaNefesh. So I want to thank you again for offering your time and your expertise to share with us this afternoon. A public service announcement: Yizkor begins at 4:30 and Nila at 5:30. So splash some cold water on your face and get comfortable, or not too comfortable.
Right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Claudia.
Claudia.
May you have a meaningful. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Claudia. You be sealed.
Thank you.
And the book of life
Thank
for a good
you.
year. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.